Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, proud patriot of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today, our special 4th of July sesquicentennial episode, is Jacob Siegel. He's an editor at Tablet Magazine, a writer. He's an Iraq and Afghanistan vet. He is co-host of the Manifesto podcast with Phil Cly, and he's author of the new book, The Information State, which we will not be discussing today. I think I mentioned it briefly, but there are a bunch of other podcasts that Jacob's been on talking about that book. Today, we are talking about the first installment of a column that he is now writing for Tablet. I forget what the name of the column is, but this one was titled The Disappearing American Man, and it sort of scratched all of the itches. It prodded the pressure points of my psyche in all sorts of ways: men, politics, war, psychology, resentment, toxic masculinity, positive masculinity, all the good stuff. So I read it, and I was like, I got to have him on to talk about this. I've been reading his stuff and listening to the podcast for a while, so it was a good opportunity to connect with him. So to give you a sense of the essay, which is slightly to the left or maybe to the right or just below or above the typical crisis of masculinity polemic, let me read a particularly pungent passage from it. So here is Jacob writing: "What I see in many prominent and representative American men today is a dribbling sludge of bitterness, a peacocking display of impotence, debility, worminess, insincerity, lack of confidence, lack of competence, lack of élan, pettiness, selfishness, scheming, and self-pity. Not all men, as the saying goes, but enough to pass a civilizational tipping point. The young men standing up at town hall meetings are almost pompous in their bitterness. The anonymous posters online have turned cattiness and petty sadism into a group erotic ritual. The politicians are embittered, the podcasters are embittered, even the popular comedians are embittered. Probably the comedians are the most bitter of all. Much of this bitterness seems to stem from an ambient feeling of betrayal. Today's American man knows that he's been wronged by globalist elites and international pedophile rings, or else by his own toxic masculinity, by immigrants, or perhaps by his innate racism, by woke capital, diversity, equity, inclusion, greedy billionaires, and unappreciative modern women, and by the Jews, of course, always by the Jews. It's not that none of these forces is real. To the contrary, the obsessive preoccupation with the betrayals perpetrated by opaque yet all-powerful oppressors makes it impossible to meaningfully address him." So that's just a taste. It's a pretty intense, hard-charging essay. I would say there's more or less two overlapping arguments in the essay. One is about this bitterness as it's expressed in the more venomous, less inhibited regions of the right, which Siegel traces to the effects of the failed wars after 9/11. I mean, the thesis being something like, when the globe-bestriding American military colossus can't beat a bunch of goat herders, it powerfully undermines the projective identity that so many men, and I think particularly men on the right, have had with American military power. Its power is our power. And so then when its power is undermined so thoroughly, it strikes right at the core of people's identity, their sense of themselves as men. And what some people did with that searing sense of impotence was to turn it not just against the left, though certainly there's some of that, and that's the kind of traditional right-wing move, but in this case against the American soldier himself, and then behind him what the American soldier traditionally has represented, which is American power, American might, American manliness. And then there's a kind of larger theory narrative, which is that so much of the period of American power, the post-war period till the end of the Cold War period of American power, was in fact a kind of long, deep con from the globalists of a true, kind of more pure, more innocent American spirit. So that's kind of argument one. And the other argument, which I think is downstream of that one, is that kind of a manifestation of that, or an effect of that, is that the cultural idea of the American man has become exhausted. So that élan radiating figure who stood a certain way, held a cigarette a certain way, often looked on the world with a certain cool disdain, has kind of died, or at least for the moment. So an archetype there that was capacious enough over the decades to manifest in figures as diverse as kind of manly Hemingway, the dandy Gatsby, the stoic Marlboro Man, swaggering Muhammad Ali, and Jacob's candidate for the last of the great American men, the alienated Kurt Cobain, seems to no longer be producing new manifestations of itself. The world spirit, in that sense, has abandoned that. And then braiding through these two arguments is Jacob's own story of being in the wars. He did 15 months in Iraq, and then after some years in which he kind of failed to figure out life as a civilian, he re-enlisted. He signed up again, went back to Afghanistan in a different space. And in some sense, in his narrative, it was kind of in that space that he was able to sort of put together some pieces, reassemble himself in a way that could go on to do some flourishing in the aftermath. The piece opens with a road trip he takes with a bunch of enlisted guys from his unit over whom he had command. They sort of semi-illicitly liberated a van from the motor pool, and they went to see families of two soldiers who'd been killed by an IED in their last month over there. And he talks about being the only officer in this tight group of enlisted men, some of whom had some real suspicion of him. He talks about kind of the guilt and dislocation of that kind of interregnum between his two tours. He talks about various soldiers he knows or knew, including one who wrote the very full metal jacket in dust on the kind of, I think it was like a shield, a kind of glass shield on one of their vehicles. It said, "Smile, there are IEDs everywhere." He later killed himself. And there we kind of go everywhere. We go into his theory of how the right talked itself into treating World War II as kind of the original sin of American betrayal, the war that, of course, the Jews tricked us into. How that recasts the greatest generation as a bunch of cucks. How a guy like Tucker Carlson, who was such a cheerleader for the Iraq War, has rebranded himself into a state of metaphysical victimhood and purity. And how the kind of implication of that, which is that the American man has no agency, no sin, nothing to do but get betrayed. So it's kind of a purity, but then there's a kind of cuckitude to it. Also, it's complicated. He goes back to Nietzsche and ressentiment as a kind of core psychological motivating pulse in all of this. And I offer up my friend Sigmund Freud as a counterproposal, which he agrees to consider. We touch on some sort of analogs for how he's characterizing the current period. The obvious ones, I think, being the kind of Weimar stab in the back myth, and then sort of post-Vietnam America and that sort of culture and the pathologies and the narratives that grew up around it. We argue a bit, though very civilly, about whether the badass special forces operator you see in so many Netflix shows and kind of relatively low-budget action movies and TV shows runs counter to his thesis or is in fact a kind of covert manifestation of it. You'll gather from the episode when you hear it that Jacob now lives in Israel, and also that we recorded this when there were sort of active hostilities between Israel and Iran. So the whole thing is bookended by missiles or the threat of missiles. There was an attack 30 minutes before we started, and then we end pretty abruptly when an actual air raid warning goes off in the background at Jacob's home, and so he has to get off and go to the shelter. So that is a first for the pod, it ending with an air raid warning. So in general, as you'll gather, we get deep in the shit. It's pretty good. Thanks again to Josh Howard for his editing work on the episode. He told me later that he had to pause at a few points to catch his breath. So intense was the conversation. So potent was the masculine forces that were circulating back and forth between me and Jacob. That the process of editing was a kind of experience of sort of masculinist catharsis in and of itself. So thanks to Josh for going through that on my behalf. And I hope all of you have similar or different kinds of experiences listening to this episode. Hope you enjoy. Peace. Hey.
Daniel, how are you, man?
Good. So are you in Israel? Is that where you live?
Yeah, I'm in Israel, and we just had a missile attack like 30 minutes ago.
Oh, wow.
So if there's another one, I would suggest if you can just wait it out. Okay. Usually it's only about 15 minutes in the bomb shelter. It'll be, given how difficult it is to schedule stuff these days, if you can wait it out, I would recommend.
Sure.
Let's just wait it out.
Yeah, well, this is the first for the podcast. So I didn't realize, until you mentioned in our exchange of emails that you lived over there. How long have you been over there?
Since 2021.
Oh, okay.
5 years.
Okay. So what prompted that? I'm curious.
I wanted to live in Israel. I wanted to make Aliyah. I wanted to raise my children here.
Well, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome to Eminent Americans. You're hereby anointed an eminent American by the power vested in me by my brother, Mark Oppenheimer, former colleague of yours at Tablet Magazine. Yeah, good to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Congratulations on the book, which just came out a week ago?
Comes out next week on the 24th.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, I was going to say you're the author of this new book, The Information State, which I see over what looks like your left shoulder.
That's it, yeah.
And you're the co-host of the Manifesto podcast. I'm trying to remember in my head, is it Manifesto with man is kind of set apart typographically in some sense, right?
No, it's the eccentricity, the syntactical eccentricity is that there is an exclamation mark after manifesto.
Okay.
The idea originally was a total whim with no real thought behind it that then obligated me for the first however many years of recording to emphatically pronounce manifesto every time we recorded it, which my co-host Phil Cly, always got a kick out of. So I don't think we would have stuck with it, since it's kind of annoying to have to type it out that way every time, if not for the fact that we just were amused by it.
Well, I don't think it's totally accidental that I projected a sort of man onto it. That masculinity, manliness is some kind of implicit or maybe often explicit theme in that podcast that you guys do. It's also this sort of proximate reason we're here today, because you wrote this piece, which I guess was maybe the first of what is going to be a column. Is that right? For Tablet I think it's had two different titles. I think it's like The Disappearing American Man, either for Tablet, because then it ran in Free Press as well, and then I forget what the other title was.
Yeah, I don't remember either, but that you're right that Free Press gave it a different title, but I forgot what it was. But yeah, so this was the inaugural column. I'm sharing that column called No Other Gods with David Samuels. So we alternate months. He's got a great column this month about how Jay Gatsby was secretly a Jew. So the crypto Judaism of Jay Gatsby is this month, and then I'll have something next month that I think will infuriate and antagonize many people who are putatively in the same free speech camp as I am, going after the free speech racket, as it were.
Well, I kind of want to get to that. Maybe we'll get to that in some fashion. What is the concept for the column? Because I have, a data set of one, in terms of what the column is about. 'Cause I don't know if David Samuels, if his piece is out yet. It sounds like maybe it's not out yet.
No, it's out now.
Okay.
But, I think it's for subscribers only at this point. The concept of the column is it's a subject I haven't given a great deal of thought to in terms of how I would articulate it if asked that question. Essentially, it's a column that allows for a kind of literary style of essay that seems to have largely gone out of fashion in many American magazines, but that Tablet still believes strongly in which there's a strong authorial voice. There's a room for a kind of experimental, essayistic approach combined with what are aspirationally, at least, probing considerations of both philosophical and topical issues and like cultural meanderings, and like all of that.
Wait, so what you're really saying is this is a column constructed to let you and David write about whatever the fuck you want to write about.
It's a column that was constructed to let... Yeah, absolutely, yes. It's a column that was constructed to let David write whatever David wanted to write about, and then I was lucky enough to step in and be the junior partner and take up half of that space. And I'm thrilled with it. It's a kind of dream assignment for a writer, and I'm hoping to make the most of it.
I mean, I say that, I laughed, I'm teasing. Of course, I have a podcast that I've titled Eminent Americans that I claim is about the contemporary American intellectual scene, which is just a thin veneer for me to just do whatever the fuck I want. So I'm just accusing you of being in the same bucket I'm in. So I really enjoyed this essay. You would have no reason to know this. I mean, it tickled my nether regions, in a good way, in so many different ways. But I'm curious, Give me the backstory on it. So you guys have decided to do this column. You're sitting there thinking about, okay, what is the first one going to be? And then it ends up being this kind of wide-ranging essay. I mean, I'll try and distill this, but I mean, we'll get into it in much depth. In a sense, arguing that like at least part of the story of the crisis of American masculinity goes back to 9/11, but more than 9/11, to the disastrous wars that are the aftermath of 9/11. That somehow, I mean, this was my take on it, that somehow just kind of poisoned the well of American masculinity in this kind of interesting way, that to go beyond just the people who served over there, who served in those wars, of whom you're one, to kind of the median American man, or at least a certain type of median American man who somehow absorbed, and I say somehow not with skepticism, but just with kind of that it's a literary kind of essayistic leap, absorbed a sense of betrayal from that. Is that a fair kind of like high level description of it?
No, I think that's very accurate. We're going to have to return to the question of why it was your nether regions in particular that were tickled by the essay.
Well, but, I should say all of my regions, all my erogenous zones all over my body. Okay. I started with the nether ones, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair characterization of the essay. How I came to write it was really just that it was a subject I'd been thinking about for a long time, and which had seemed to become more pressing as the theme of victimhood and betrayal became more salient on the American right in particular. It seemed to draw the essay out of me in a way that the sort of diminution of manhood on the left had not, in part because the attack on manhood, I mean, that's a broad characterization, obviously, but let's put it in terms native to the, like, endemic to the class that produced this critique. The problematization of masculinity had been ongoing on the left for decades. Right. It was nothing particularly out of the ordinary, and so therefore was easier to consider a part of the background of the culture. But as the right took up this victimhood narrative and explicitly cast it in anti-Semitic terms and through the use of anti-Jewish tropes, it called attention to itself. It was something I had been thinking about for a long time. But that was in a sense the proximate start of the essay. In particular, I'm not a scholar of Christianity. I'm not a Christian theologian. I'm a Jew, for one thing, and also I don't consider myself any kind of authority on the Christian Bible or on Christian dogma or doctrine. But my understanding was that, the figure of Jesus Christ was supposed to represent the ultimate sacrificial victim, as it were. And yet I saw, like, through characters like Tucker Carlson, this sort of embrace of a all-encompassing metaphysical victimhood, right? Like, at the same time that Tucker was repositioning himself as a Christian above all else. Yeah. This is not the way he used to talk. If you look at Tucker Carlson, even from 5 years ago, he didn't preface every statement with, as a Christian, and I am a Christian, So he started to embrace this explicitly sectarian language because the way in which he uses Christianity is in a kind of third world sectarian way. This is his language of Christianity. And as he began to embrace this language of Christianity, it turned out that this was concurrent with a revisionist reimagining of American history as a series of betrayals by demonic forces and by Jews, in which the character of the American man had no agency at all. Why was America involved in World War II? World War II being the sort of centerpiece of this mythology. Zionist financiers had tricked America into entering into World War II on behalf of their Zionist ambitions and whatever, like, demonic Jewish conspiracies. So in Tucker's version of Christianity, what it means to be a Christian is to have no sin, Like I had thought prior to this that maybe Christianity was about the notion that we're all sinners, and like that was my outsider's understanding. But no, it turns out that in the way that Tucker means it, it's that you're totally blameless at everything where there might be some agency or responsibility imputed to you as a character within this polity, the nation state. No, you have no agency at all. You're only ever being betrayed. Now, as I said, like that was the proximate trigger to write the essay. Right. That's not the sort of conceptual framework of the essay, but that was the thing that took this thing that I had been thinking about for a long time, which was about the sort of the diminution, the way in which the power and appeal and charisma of American manhood, which I had grown up on, and which I don't reduce to some sort of macho caricature. That's just to be clear for anyone who hasn't read the essay. I hope you will go read the essay, The Disappearing American Men, because I think that, it speaks for itself.
It's recognizable as some version of the kind of classic Marlboro Man, some version of that, but it is more sophisticated than that.
Well, that's a facet of it. The Marlboro Man is a facet of it.
Right.
But, it's not for nothing that when I list the attributes of this kind of manhood, élan is one of the attributes that I list. There was a kind of stylistic, sophisticated approach to living as an adult in the world that I associate with American manhood.
Right. I think you mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald as a kind of type. I mean, I think you even mentioned Kurt Cobain as a type, which was interesting.
I think Kurt Cobain is a totally emblematic, paradigmatic American man.
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated figure, but the point ultimately was not to hoist up this figure as some kind of secular saint or as a model for how I want my son to behave in the world. That's not the point. The point is to say these were figures that exuded tremendous power and charisma, and something has happened such that that kind of power and charisma seems to have largely disappeared from the culture. It just doesn't exist in the same generative, vital way where, you have a figure like a Cobain or a Muhammad Ali who spawns a whole generation of imitators around the world, not even in America alone. But that had been sapped away, and I trace that back to the global war on terrorism and the failures in the global war on terrorism, the wars in which I fought.
I want to go back to this Tucker Carlson narrative for a second, because it's just something I'm not that familiar with. I mean, one of the things, I want to go back to what point Tucker, and I'm not sure to what extent he's the author of this narrative or just a participant in it, but, to what point he traces the fall, when the betrayals began. I was going to say something you said in your article that I just don't know, because I haven't spent, I've spent my time in various fever swamps, but just the alt-right one, like just even this idea that I just didn't know this, that like veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan are sort of viewed in some sectors of like, I don't even know if we're calling it the alt-right, whatever, as like cucks essentially, as buffoons, as fools. I just had a more simplistic understanding that there was this kind of embrace, Curtis Yarvin embrace of kind of Bronze Age pervert, embrace of a sort of caricatured, He-Man, in which I would assume that American veterans and special forces operatives and all types like that would have been heroic figures. I do want to get up to that because that's interesting, but just, is Carlson the primary author of this narrative, or is he kind of, and to when do we trace the fall? I assume it's not going back to the founding, right?
What doesn't go back to the founding?
The idea of us being betrayed, of the real American, the victim, the good innocent victim being betrayed by demonic forces, Jews, communists, like literal demons, whomever.
Well, look, it ebbs and flows. The period we're living through now is not the first period in American history to feature this motif. Obviously, it was there after the Civil War, but in the 20th century, I trace it to not even September 11th per se, but let's say to 6-7 years after September 11th, when it became clear that Iraq was not going to end in victory, when Afghanistan went from being the good war to a kind of irresolvable problem at some point around then, which, not coincidentally is about when the late 2000 aughts is when the alt-right really begins to sort of take off. This is when these themes develop. And they develop as a critique of not just America and American power, but also as a critique of liberalism and modernity. And because they develop as a critique of liberalism and modernity, there is a desire to be transgressive against the shibboleths, against the pieties of liberalism, and against America as a liberal nation. And what this ends up meaning is that there is, this sort of disgust towards boomers, right? The disgust towards boomers is an expression of the idea that there's a sickness in America itself, and that the so-called greatest generation were really just a bunch of cucks. So, like, you say that, you raise a very legitimate question, wait, I thought that the right would kind of venerate these special operators as he-men. The right is at this point like a complicated melange of overlapping pathologies and lunatic fringes that have come together. But Yarvin is, first of all, both of the guys you listed, maybe that wouldn't apply to for different reasons. Yarvin, because he's a kind of presents himself as like an aloof figure who wouldn't be taken in by that kind of populist demotic energy. And then BAP we could just leave aside. The point is that a segment of the right, a part of the right, which was next to, adjacent to the Yarvinite and Bapite, right, that a part of the right, the part that Tucker is drawing on now, wanted to reject liberalism altogether, decided that World War II was the foundational event in the ethos of, let's say, like multiculturalist 20th century progressive liberalism, and therefore wanted to discredit World War II, or you could argue that I'm like reversing cause and effect here, but whatever it was, they ended up at the idea that World War II was a mistake, that we were pulled into World War II by the Jews, and that World War II, the victory in World War II, the great American mythology of the greatest generation, not only is a lie, but it's actually the founding myth that led us into our current state of decadence and globalist, all of that.
Yeah.
But what I would argue is that popularization of the revisionist account of World War II is itself downstream of the failure of the global war on terror. Because what the global war on terror does for this segment of the right is to convince them that American power is not only pernicious, but is not actually being carried out in America's interest, is not tied to the American interest in any way. And they simultaneously develop this critique while seeking to exonerate themselves, right? So they need a version of this that demonizes their enemies while also exonerating themselves. So this is, Carlson is the example par excellence for this, right? Carlson, who was a champion of the Iraq War, who tries to now sort of minimize his cheerleading for that war, but like who was appearing on, Bubba the Love Sponge radio show to say, like, let's bomb all these Muslim heathens, can't be like most adult Americans in the political sphere who got this question wrong and grapple with it in an honest way. No, he thinks like he's a saint because he had a change of mind about the Iraq War, and it's all the fault of these nefarious Semitic homiciding characters around him who tricked him into doing this, tricked him into it. And then he takes that back to World War II. It becomes a totalizing worldview. And in the process of doing that, it's necessary for him to demolish the kind of character of the American man, because the character of the American man is at the very center of these pivotal world historical events that he's now saying led to our ruin.
It's funny. This is a total aside. As you were talking and I was thinking about all those themes, the face that popped in my head was Don Draper, who I think maybe, did he serve in World War II or Korea? Korea. I'm trying to remember. But it's interesting. I mean, you're thinking about like American cool and American charisma. And Don Draper kind of popped into my head as maybe the best American male archetype of the sort that you're describing as globe bestriding in recent memory. Like, I'm not sure who would sort of supersede Don Draper as that figure in the last kind of decade or two. You actually, I don't know if you literally start the essay, but in a sense, you start the essay by talking about this road trip that you took after you got back from Iraq. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, that obviously plays a kind of important role in the sort of structure of the essay and the kind of framing of the essay. So you got back, you were in Iraq, you did time in Iraq, and then later, 5 years later, you did time in Afghanistan. I think you said you did 15 months in Iraq. When was that? And so when did you get back? When was this road trip that you took with some of the men whose officer I think you had been, right?
So I was in Iraq during the bloodiest period of the Iraqi civil war and the surge for most all of 2006, and then a substantial portion of 2007 for just under 15 months in total. And I was actually with a number of different units. While I was in Iraq, I voluntarily extended my deployment. So I ended up serving in a few different units. And the final unit that I served in was a unit that was doing, it's a long story, but essentially it was a unit that was sort of cobbled together as like a hodgepodge assembly from all these other units because they didn't have enough soldiers, because the army was stretched very thin at that point because of the surge. And so I ended up in this very strange unit where anybody who has any experience in the army will get this immediately. But basically, like, I had National Guardsmen, reservists, and former active duty. I had non-combat National Guardsmen and reservists, and then former active duty infantry soldiers who'd been called up out of what's called the Individual Ready Reserve, all together in one unit. Like, I literally, I had cooks and a former Ranger member of 2nd Ranger Battalion who was on the Jessica Lynch rescue mission serving together in the same unit, which is just basically unheard of. It's like, it doesn't happen. It was a very volatile mixture inherently that was made much worse because our leadership and my company's leadership was really atrocious. And so we were doing what's called a convoy escort mission. That's a mission where essentially there are these long convoys of supply vehicles, typically civilian supply vehicles, but sometimes military supply vehicles that are taking all different kinds of supplies between the bases in Iraq, and we were their security. We would escort them to provide security for these supply convoys.
Sounds safe.
What's that?
I said sounds safe. Sounds like a safe assignment.
Right. So it was a very dangerous, deadly assignment. And during my last month in Iraq, 2 of my soldiers were killed by an IED. And shortly after my unit returned from Iraq, we were going through this process of demobilization at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And in the process of that demobilization, a bunch of us had decided we were going to go visit the families of the 2 soldiers who were killed.
Had that not had you not had soldiers die under you before, or?
No, I hadn't. I'd had a soldier get very seriously wounded on a mission that I was on. I don't talk about this in the essay. I've never written about any of this before. It's not...
Well, that was a question I had for you, because I was kind of looking around, and I was wondering if this was the first time...
Yeah, it's the first...
written in some detail about some of these things.
It's the first time I've written about any of this. I had alluded to it in fiction in the past. It was the closest I ever got to it. I wrote a story called Smile, There Are IEDs Everywhere, which was... drawn from some of those experiences, but a totally fictional account. But that message, smile, there are IEDs everywhere, was an actual inscription written in dust on the turret glass by one of the gunners from my platoon, Jacob Blaylock Jackie, who was one of my soldiers who was killed. So there was all this dust that had accrued. Basically, the gunner is the guy who stands up in the Humvee, and there's a kind of shield around him, and there's bulletproof glass as part of that shield so he can see through it. All this dust had caked onto it, and then Jackie, as we called him, had written. He was a brilliant musician. He's really an incredible, very sensitive guy who never should have been in Iraq to begin with because he had some serious mental health problems. And Jackie later, he killed himself after we got back. So he's not actually, Jackie was not one of the soldiers I'm talking about in this essay, but he committed suicide not long after we got back. But Jackie had written, smile, there are IEDs everywhere in the dust on his turret shield. And so
in the sense, if you see like a minivan covered in dust in the parking lot at the grocery store, somebody will write a smiley face. You will draw a smiley face or something like that.
Right. So,
okay. Yeah.
So anyway, so the closest I ever got to writing about this was in this story that had this character based on Jackie, and but the two. I hadn't written about these experiences before, and I don't in general write about the sort of tactical or combat aspect of my experiences. I've avoided that for close to 20 years. It's just, for various reasons, not something I wanted to write about. But we decided, myself and a number of other soldiers decided to go see the families of the two soldiers who were killed, Joshua Schmidt and Brandon Wallace. And there was not a disagreement, but there was resistance to me going along because I was an officer. And all of these other guys were part of this group that I mentioned earlier. They were all members of, as were Brandon and Joshua, they were members of the individual ready reserve. So they're all active duty infantry soldiers who had been called back into the unit.
It sounds like it wasn't, was it not just that you were an officer and they weren't, but that also you hadn't been serving with them for that long?
Yes,
it was
exactly.
A complicated unit that was mixing all these different. So I was surprised at how much distance it sounded like there was, and I just don't know enough about military life. And so you're saying part of it was just the natural distance between commanding officer and the people who were serving under, but part of it was just that this particular unit was an atypical one.
Yes, precisely. But that was further compounded by the fact that the leadership of our company was really cowardly and aggravated these tensions that were already there.
I think you said you've never hated anybody as much as him before or since.
Yeah.
The line was something like that in the piece. Yeah.
Yeah, my company commander at the time, that's true. So, but what had happened was about 4 months prior to the end of our deployment, I had been on a mission where another one of my soldiers, we hit an IED, another one of my soldiers got very seriously wounded. I had the medic in my vehicle at the time, and basically I medevaced that soldier. I got him back to the U.S. After getting him back to the U.S., I took leave. I had been in Iraq for, I believe, 11 and a half months before I got my first and only R&R leave from Iraq, which is unusual. Most people do 12-month deployment, so they'll take their leave at the 6 or 7 month mark, let's say. Yeah. I had done a full deployment before I even got leave, and when I got leave, I took part of my leave and I went to Walter Reed to visit this soldier of mine who had gotten blown up, who had gotten very seriously wounded. And I mention that because when there was some resistance to me going on this road trip, my friend Brian, who became my best friend, who I was close with even in Iraq, but we had a complicated relationship there, for one thing because he was my subordinate, and also because of these dynamics in the unit. We later became extremely close. But Brian, when he was telling, by the way, it wasn't everybody in the group who was resistant. Yeah. There was really one guy who was resistant, but that carried a lot of sway because they were this tight-knit group and I wasn't part of them. And Brian had said to this one guy, No, Siegel went to Walter Reed. Like he needs to be there also. Basically, is how that got resolved. So long story short,
Brian is the one you refer to in the piece as the mountain.
Yeah,
right.
Because he's 6'3", 250 pounds, just an enormous guy.
I imagine him as bearded. Is he usually bearded?
Not bearded, but a mountain of a man. Also really smart, brilliant, sensitive artist, a photographer who, went to an Ivy League college and is a fascinating, complicated, brilliant guy. And a whole story unto himself, of course. But the long and short of it is that the decision was made we were all going to go. One of the soldiers, funny enough, the guy who didn't want me to come originally, he commandeered a military van from the motor pool on base through means that were semi-licit, but also this is a rich tradition within the military. You say you acquired something. You're not really stealing it, but it's just sitting there. We're going to make good use of it.
Have you seen the movie Stripes?
A long time ago.
Anyway, there's a fair amount of acquisition of various things. I'm laughing. Obviously, this is very serious stuff. It does strike me.
It was funny too.
As I'm sure it struck you at a million different times, this is all very cinematic, fiction, novelistic. I mean, from the, one version of that story of cobbling together this unit is it's this ragtag group that should never have worked, and it coalesces into, with I mean, and this is part of the story. I mean, I think you have a point where you're talking about different archetypes of the American man, right? And there is this long tradition in movies in particular of the unit, and you have the urban ethnic, and you have the farm boy from Iowa, and you have the black guy from Detroit. And there's a version of your story, which is obviously is not, where there's a version of all of these stories that's a kind of heartwarming, heartbreaking movie or something like that, whether it's the road trip, whether it's the unit, in Iraq, even with the deaths and all of these things. It's interesting. Obviously, this. It's interesting that you haven't written about it much as a writer. And your co-host on your podcast is Phil Cly, who has written about a lot of this stuff, who also served. And anyway, just all of the above. It's an interesting that for me, from the outside, as somebody who's just a writer, these are all very novelistic, filmic.
I think that it was just too close to the bone.
Yeah.
It was both too close to the bone for me, and it was also, I recoiled from the obviously novelistic aspects of it that, rather than inducing me to write about it, I think convinced me for many years not to write about it. And this is not to cast aspersions on anyone who did write about these things. I don't attribute any virtue to my not writing about it. It wasn't some lofty thing. It was, I couldn't write about it in the way that I trusted. And I also didn't want to write about it. These were not things that I wanted to think about, much less express publicly. That road trip that we ended up going on to see the families was a difficult but profound experience. And when I came back from it, I didn't have a easy way that I could figure out to slot back into life, and to a life that I was proud of. I was full of guilt and shame over what had happened, and I was also full of inchoate feelings that I didn't, the impulse to, whatever the terminology would be, to work through these things was not, I didn't have it. I wasn't looking to work through anything at the time. Yeah. And I had a very difficult first few years back, probably more than the first few years. It's not that, I don't want to over dramatize it. I wasn't,
you weren't an addict.
I wasn't an addict. I wasn't homeless. I also wasn't suffering from debilitating, acute, chronic mental conditions or PTSD. I was just full of shame and grief, and also a sense of displacement of trying to figure out what had gone wrong and how I was going to rectify it, and why I didn't feel as powerful back home as I had overseas. And all of these things that I was trying to figure out. And I was writing at the time, and I was really writing fiction at the time. This is actually where I met Phil Klein. I met Roy Scranton and Matt Gallagher, all of whom would continue to be close friends. And I would collaborate with them on this anthology that we did together, Fire and Forget, which was the first anthology of fiction by Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. But, I didn't talk to them about any of this. I mean, Phil...
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Phil did not know many of the details in the story that I tell in the tablet piece. Not because I chose to withhold them from Phil in particular. Phil is one of my closest friends. It wasn't something that I'd chosen to write about. And I'm not, for whatever reason, it wasn't something that I had chosen to write about or to talk about much.
I'm curious, can I ask, when you, I don't know if enlisted is the right word, when you enlisted, where was masculinity in the mix? Because I think, not everybody's listening to this will know, you come from, in certain ways, a family not that dissimilar from mine. Your father was a writer and academic, your brother's a writer, I think your mom is maybe an academic as well. So, I mean, you come from a highly educated, highly intellectual Jewish family. Are you from New York? Was that where you grew up? You grew up in the city?
Yeah, from Brooklyn.
So not the typical commanding officer in Iraq, or maybe it is, I don't know. But my naive, the narrative that pops into my head is, it's not quite somebody who has something to prove, but it's somebody who, when you decide to go to war, to become a soldier, it's not the kid who's enlisting to get out of a rough circumstance at home, right? To get out of the inner city or wherever. It's somebody who's making a very deliberate, conscious choice. I would think masculinity is somewhere in that mix in a complicated, interesting way. And maybe not consciously, but at least retrospectively.
No, even at the time, it was at the forefront. It was at the very forefront. Though, the idea that the U.S. Army, which is an enormous, sprawling organization, or the military at large, is mostly made up of poor farm kids or desperate characters who see a judge who tells them, like it's jail or the military it's not true. It's an enormous organization. There are a lot of people there for economic motives, but I wasn't that unusual.
Well, there's a lot of parts of the country where there's a real tradition and, multi-generational tradition of serving.
Yeah, I had a tradition in my own family as well, which is part of what motivated me and was very much connected to that idea of masculinity. My father was both exactly who you describe him as. He was an academic, he was an intellectual, he was a writer, and he was a very, my father's a real serious intellectual. It wasn't his aspiration to be a pundit or a popular intellectual. Simultaneously, my father's father was a Normandy veteran. My father didn't serve in Vietnam. He'd had so my father didn't serve in the military, but my father revered his father, who was a Normandy veteran. And my father was both a very serious, very scholarly intellectual, and also a bit of a tough guy and a bit of, had grown up in the Jacob Riis housing projects on the Lower East Side and had, I saw my father get into street fights when I was a kid. And wow. So I grew up with a masculine archetype, which certainly imposed itself on me, which required both intense intellectualism and a willingness to fight.
So he had not shed his working class macho vibe. He had not shed that when he went off to college and got his PhD. He retained that energy.
No, that was him through and through.
Yeah.
He didn't shed it. At the same time, my father wasn't like pandering to anyone, and he wasn't doing some kind of, it wasn't some kind of act. It's who he was, and the two things coexisted. My father didn't pretend to be something he wasn't for anyone. So it's not like he didn't get into a street fight because he was pretending to be a tough guy that day. And then among the intellectuals, he carried on he was like, in ways that were, I think, defining of who he was. This all coexisted in him, sometimes in somewhat unreconciled ways, but it's who he was. the image of masculinity that I grew up with, it wasn't about, he wasn't some kind of macho tough guy. He was more like a knock around outer borough guy who was also extraordinarily learned and intellectual, and who revered intellectualism, and who also revered, as I said, his father, my grandfather, who was a Normandy veteran. So I grew up with all of that. I certainly felt like I had something to prove. I knew I wasn't going to be, as smart as my father. It didn't seem possible to exceed what he had accomplished intellectually, but I thought, I'm sure that was part of it. I thought that I can be part of this thing which I know he reveres, and which will connect me to his father. And I also revered my grandfather, and so that was all very much present.
So you were what, 21 when 9/11 happened? So what's the chronology? You were...
I was 20 and enlisted a few months later. So I think...
Were you in college at that point?
I was in college at that point, right.
And then, so you enlisted, you left college to enlist, or you graduated?
I left college to do my initial training. I returned to college, graduated, and then was in Iraq within, I think, a year after graduating.
Where'd you go to college?
Boston University.
Okay. So you really did inherit, you did in a very sort of clear way, you did sort of inherit, you had this family tradition of both serving in the military with your grandfather, revering the military with your father. 9/11 happens. Was it something you'd thought about before, about joining? Like you weren't, it doesn't sound like you were in ROTC.
No, it wasn't something I'd really thought about before, but I had grown up with this image of my grandfather, and I had, I think the clearest feeling that I had was, who am I to not go? Mm-hmm. I think that was a strong feeling that I had. There was a war. Other people were going.
Yep.
And I had the sense that I should be part of it. I had the sense that I should be part of it, both in ways that were about proving something to myself, chasing personal glory, etc. I have a tendency when I recount this, which I do less and less as the years pass, but I have a tendency when I recount it to either emphasize the selfless aspect or the mercenary aspect, right? So I tend to either present it as I was really only going to prove something to myself, or I was really only going because it was what my nation asked of me. The truth is they were both there. They were, they were both right on the surface. But the sense, especially after being at ground zero, the sense of this is happening, this is the history I'm living through, and I'm meant to be a part of it. And who am I? Therefore, who am I to seek a way out of it? I really felt like I was already a part of it.
Yeah.
And so to not go would have been, it wouldn't have been, I didn't see it as me exercising an individual choice in the sense that I could choose to go, I could choose to not go. I saw it as an abdication. That was the view that I developed at the time.
Do you think you would have been ashamed if you hadn't gone?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe for the rest of your life.
Yes.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I was living in New York at the time. I was in grad school. I mean, I had some of that feeling, obviously not nearly as intensely as you did. I didn't think about signing up. I didn't think about enlisting. But I do remember that sense, which is now, 25 years in the past, of that sense of obligation, that sense of just injury being done. And I was just living in New York. You grew up there. I mean, your whole life was there. I mean, that injury being done to the city, to the nation. So you got back. I'm trying to visualize you getting back. I mean, I think you described this. I mean, you talk about the shame and the guilt. You also sound like somebody, I mean, the way you describe your decision, I think maybe it was your friend Brian who said this to the other guys in the unit when you were sort of deciding whether you would go with him or not, was something like, he's going to go anyway. Like whether we take it with us or he goes separately. And part of what came across was that you were very stuck in your own head. You were very trapped in your own head at that point when you were back. Is that, I don't think you literally say that, but that's kind of what comes across in the way you describe it. You were trapped in ideas of kind of honor and obligation and, that you would have no choice but to go visit the families of these guys who died under your command.
I think that's very much the case. And that ties directly into the theme of the tablet essay in the sense that you're trying to make sense of what honor and obligation mean relative to wars that you don't believe in and that you think are, not simply it wasn't to me principally a moral question, are these good wars or bad wars? The question was, can we win? Was the first thing that occurred to me. And is it worth winning?
Right.
The moral dimension to me was, is the victory worth it? Are we winning something worth fighting for? That was the way that I was thinking about it. And I didn't arrive at the conclusion that some of my contemporaries arrived at, which is that either no war was justified after 9/11 or that 9/11 itself was a just verdict on American empire, or that, it was a justifiable blowback for whatever U.S. Zionist imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. That was never a temptation for me. I never felt any of that. What I did feel was, we're lying to ourselves. We're not going to accomplish the things that we claim we're going to accomplish. We've been lying to ourselves for a while. What are we doing here? And why are we lying to ourselves? And why do we seem incapable of desisting from this lie? Why are we so attached to these lies that we're telling about these wars? And why are we so attached to the continuation of these wars, which are fictions in the sense that they're not accomplishing what they're supposed to accomplish? That was the way I experienced it principally. And so that my critique was never based on the U.S. has no right to wage war. My critique was based on what I described, and with an understanding that if you're going to wage war, it should be to win something that's worth winning, to accomplish something that's worth accomplishing, which relates to your own peace inside your own borders, not a global transformation or a feat of social engineering abroad. And, the difficulty in talking about some of this is all of these critiques have become entangled at this point. So we can get to that, but yeah.
So what's the rupture? I mean, let's try and draw out the connection between that and this wellspring of American masculinity, right? There came into existence at some point, I'm not sure what the point was, maybe you have a better sense, this sort of masculine energy that America, above all other nations, at least for a certain period of historical time, was able to transform through its culture into these various archetypes of masculinity that were immensely compelling, immensely charismatic, travel around the globe, inspire emulation, mimesis, whatever. And then what you're positing is that in the aftermath, not so much of 9/11, but of the wars in response to 9/11, there's some kind of severing of that relationship. There's some kind of derailing of that relationship between American energies and the creation of this masculine archetype. What is that? I mean, obviously you're not thinking you don't have this all formulated at the time, but now when you're writing this piece, you're proposing something happened, right?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a way in which fairly common sense connections between cultural tropes of masculinity and even sort of more nebulous cultural energies of masculinity and warfare, that the very subject has become associated with fascism. Right, to mention that there might be some connection between these is, if not outright fascist, then proto-fascist. But the fascist connotations aside,
not on my podcast.
Right. So the fascist connotations aside, it's real.
Yeah,
and this has been a fairly consistent, common theme across cultures, across civilizations for most of human history. In the case of America, you have two things occurring. One is a grandiosity of ambition in the wars themselves that seems, in retrospect, unmanly because it appears delusional. Mm-hmm. And so it therefore seems that is by itself diminishing of the stature of the men who are conceiving of it and carrying it out. Because once it's revealed as grandiose, because it hasn't been achieved, then the dream itself seems, maybe infantile seems too strong, but there's something unserious about it, unmanly about it, because you couldn't pull it off. And that retrospectively casts the whole endeavor. It places it in a category of absurdity, which is not a very manly position to be unself-aware and absurd. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it exposes an obvious deficit of American power.
Yeah.
And, this becomes the subject of serious critical examinations, of scathing polemics, of diatribes, and also of jokes, right? Like the super highly trained, multi-trillion-dollar American army can't beat a bunch of goat-herding Taliban members in Afghanistan is a cliche. It's a joke. It's a serious critique. It's all of the above. And it is fundamentally, insofar as it is not absorbed back into the domestic political culture as a kind of serious self-critique. Why couldn't we do this?
Yep.
What did we get wrong? The butt of that joke lands on the soldier initially, who becomes a kind of farcical character, right? Or if not always farcical, at the very least, impotent, right? And impotence is a archetypally unmanly characteristic.
Yeah.
So first you start with impotence. But then to explain the impotence, very quickly, the next move, and this is something developed by the motif of betrayal on the right, the impotent man becomes a cuck.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the way this works is the soldier's impotence is not a result of failures endemic to the American character. It's not Tucker Carlson's fault.
Right.
Though he cheerleaded that war and didn't serve in it. Right? Like, though he cheerleaded a war he would not serve in and would never have sent any of his own sons to serve in.
Right.
Very quickly, as a way of bridging that gap between his own unwillingness to fight for the causes he proclaimed, he becomes a victim of outside forces. Right? And those outside forces are not always the Jews, but it tends to converge on some version of the Jews. And so the soldier goes from being a absurd character or a risible character to being a pathetic character to being a cuck. Mm. And the soldier has been cucked by these outside forces who do have agency, right? Tucker doesn't have agency. The people who sort of subscribe to this worldview, they don't have agency. They were taken advantage of. And the only way they can reclaim their agency is by naming the Jew now. But there was a demonic agent all along who was causing all of this to happen, and that was the Jew. Now, that's the most sort of poisonous version of a cultural mood that is much more pervasive in slightly less hysterical formats, though increasingly the hysterical format is the dominant mood, and you find plenty of it on the left as well. I'm focusing on the right for the time being, but the left has an almost identical view at this point. And this becomes a way of explaining the failure of American manhood, but at the same time, ironically is maybe not, I don't want to describe it as irony, I don't think it deserves that description. At the same time, pathetically, self-defeating,ly, that very self-exculpatory framework is more enfeebling. Right? So the very idea that we have been taken advantage of by outside forces is a way of retreating into a position of victimhood and is even more enfeebling. And what does the enfeebled person do? I mean, this is the point. I don't get into this in the essay, but, funny enough, the philosopher who I think does the best job maybe of explaining this turn is a German fellow by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. And, this is ressentiment.
Him or the Austrian fellow Sigmund Freud. Yeah. What were you saying?
I've heard of him as well. I've spent less time on his work, but no, it's like, this is the Nietzschean turn. This is ressentiment. And this ressentiment is now the dominant cultural mood. on the right in particular.
I mean, the two historical analogs that occur to me, I mean, I don't think you mentioned this, but it's certainly implicit in the piece, is, the whole, I wish I had the German term, at hand, but the stab in the back, the post-World War.
Of course, yeah.
World War One, betrayal of the German people by demonic forces who were primarily the Jews. And then the other one, and I think in a certain way, a more complicated one, I mean, is post-Vietnam America, and sort of thinking about the ways that the country metabolized or failed to metabolize our failure, our loss in Vietnam, where our powerful military was defeated by not goat herders, but whatever the Vietnamese equivalent of it, peasants or something like that with conical hats. And I don't know what I mean. There's a very depressing lesson to be taken from the German example, right? That we're headed for something truly cataclysmic domestically. The Vietnam War one is a little bit more complicated in terms of what the fallout from it might be and the ways that it might develop. I mean, the optimistic version is it suggests that American élan potentially could be recovered because, of course, it was for good and ill in the aftermath of Vietnam, though it took a while. Yeah, I'm trying to think about, I mean, what do you make? I'm curious because you focused on these narratives of American masculinity and the veteran as the cuck. The much more overt pop cultural manifestation, which is the one I'm the more familiar with, is the opposite, right? I mean, there is an endless number of TV shows and movies about badass special ops soldiers. I just watched this one I saw on Netflix, War Machine with Alan Ritchie, who plays the Reacher on the TV show. And I don't know if I'd be curious to know if you watch, if you're drawn to these shows or kind of repelled by these shows, or none of the above. But I mean, this show, War Machine, on Netflix, it is such a kind of extraordinary lionization, celebration, apotheosis of the American male soldier, of the Ranger.
Yeah, but it's not really. It's not really. No, it's.
Have you seen it?
It is. No, okay. But my point is that the archetype I'm describing of the soldier is the cuck, and the one you're describing of the special operations soldier is the sort of superhero, are not in opposition. They're actually closely connected because special operations represents a tiny percentage of the overall military. And the role of special operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan, though it has been expanded culturally into the sort of very heart of the war, was dwarfed by the role played by the conventional soldiers. So it is in the very fact that the special operations soldier is the only soldier who becomes a hero, who is lionized, you see implicitly the aspersions being cast on the average soldier who served in the war. The average soldier who served in the war had nothing to do with the kinds of missions and the narrative you see in these tales of heroic daring do by the special operations guys. Now, you can quibble with that in the sense that it appears to preserve at least like a certain kind of role for a conventionally understood American masculine character, but I would suggest to you that it's had no real cultural power. That, yeah, you get a Netflix movie, you get some box office movies, but it's not an archetype that anyone really emulates, that it's had very little transmissible cultural power. It's not like the World War II GI. It's not even like the Vietnam GI, who was a sort of broadly recognizable cultural type. The special operations soldier doesn't really reflect anything about America per se. He's like he kind of stands outside of the national culture, overwatching it.
I'm going to have to think about that because my initial reaction is to disagree, but I think maybe it gets into very sort of nuanced things because I've thought a lot, I think the aesthetic of those TV shows and the aesthetic, at least as I understand it, of the special ops, the kind of bearded, the scruffiness, loaded down in tactical gear. I think that aesthetic is profoundly broadly emulated, right? I think if you look at the way people are dressing, if you look at the kind of fetishization of a lot of the gear, if you look at like clothing brands, if you look at Pete Hegseth, if you look at that there is at least in that sense, it has been profoundly influential, which is not to say that, I don't think it's arguing against your overarching thesis, but I wouldn't say it has stood apart and not had influence. I think it's complicated to think about what the influence is. I think there are a lot of default American men who are identifying with projecting themselves on that archetype, in a lot of ways as a defense against some of the things, or probably as a kind of low-level psychological defense against a lot of these feelings of impotence and inefficacy and powerlessness.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that's fair. I think there's obviously a sort of tactical cool, operator cool, as it's called. But I would have to think about it more. My sense is that the power of that has been very limited and was sort of almost immediately co-opted into kind of podcaster culture in a way. Yeah. But yeah, I'd have to think about that more. I don't think that it presented anything. I think that insofar as the aesthetic itself, which by the way is also strangely sort of consonant with the whole hipster bearded thing in a way that I don't think is accidental. But
I'm interested in clothes. There's some interesting fashion lines that are actually a perfect fusion of those things and right. Super cool.
Insofar as that aesthetic was drawn from the smallest component of service members. Right. It was the most exceptional, least representative form of military experience. In itself testifies to the general lack of respect afforded to the average American soldier.
It's a defense, right? It's so obviously a defense. I'm curious how, both for you, maybe coming back after your first tour and then also after your second, but also to the extent you feel comfortable kind of saying something about your fellow soldiers. Where do you exist vis-a-vis this and living as a man and kind of thinking of yourself as a man in American society? My assumption would be thinking about the median soldier who comes back, that it's all of the above, that there are some people who are responding to some of these feelings by themselves identifying with that sort of special ops archetype or something like that, and then people who feel profoundly alienated by it, and then, whatever, all of the above. What is it like for you?
I'm full of disgust, and disgust melded with contempt. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Not for everybody, needless to say, but just today, maybe an hour before we were recording this, do you know who Joe Kent is?
No, I don't think so.
Joe Kent is a former Special Forces soldier whose wife was killed in the War on Terror, who for years had become what I thought of as a very intelligent, trenchant critic of those wars, who later became a political figure in the Peter Thiel vertical. He ran for Senate. He was backed by Thiel. He became a fixture of the Tucker Carlson world before that world had fully immersed itself in anti-Jewish obsession. And in his most recent iteration, Kent was working for Tulsi Gabbard in the Trump administration in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Just today, right before we started recording, Kent released a statement announcing his resignation as a matter of principle because he can't support the war against Iran because Iran poses no threat to the United States. Now, that's a reasonable enough position if he feels that way. However, he goes on in that same letter to say that the Israel lobby dragged America into this war, that the Israel lobby is responsible for getting his wife killed, because the Israel lobby dragged America into the Iraq war. And simultaneously, his statement is so venal and stupid that he praises Donald Trump's assassination of the Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani, as an example of the kind of effective exercise of American power that Trump has betrayed. So Kent is so caught up in this retarded anti-Jewish obsession, which obviously he sees as a political path forward, that he doesn't recognize the glaring contradiction between saying Iran poses no threat to the U.S., and so therefore the U.S. can only be coaxed into a war by the hummus eaters in Jerusalem, yet at the same time, it's good that Trump killed Soleimani. So Trump killed somebody who was posing no threat to the U.S. I mean, it's so despicable, and it's so venal, and it's so pathetic. And, I mean, my attitude towards it is I hope it all burns to the ground. I don't mean the United States, but I hope that everything that Kent is a part of, that whole wing of MAGA, of the right, I hope it all burns to the ground. And I have nothing but disgust for these people. And if Joe Kent wants to spend his life as like a self-made cuck who thinks that the U.S. has no agency and that Donald Trump was hypnotized by Jerusalem, I suppose that's his right, but he could at least bother to not be quite so stupid in his formulation of this, that he's also going to praise the killing of Soleimani, right? I mean, it's another example of the way in which this kind of anti-Jewish, which is what it actually is, monomania, poisons people's brains. But, my feeling about it is not, I want to reach out to Joe Kent and convince him that he's wrong about this. My feeling about this is that if we ever run into each other, we can sort it out. And absent that, I hope to see the whole movement he's part of destroyed utterly and razed to the ground. And I think that it's poisonous. And I also think, and this is maybe a somewhat more substantive point analytically, I also think that the reason that Kent is doing this very clearly is because it represents a viable political opportunity for him. Blaming Israel for getting the U.S. into the war, which will be praised to the high heavens by all manner of both Bangladeshi groypers and Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson and whomever else, and whatever European America watchers who love to praise this kind of thing. On the one hand, it'll be presented as a matter of martyrdom and of principle, but the more clear-sighted reading of it is that it's not him martyring himself, it's him setting up his next political run. He believes that his political fortunes lie in running as the America is a perpetual victim of the global Jewish conspiracy. That is now a real part of not only political discourse in the United States, but of the political culture, the electoral calculation made by ambitious, venal characters like Joe Kent, whose personal tragedies have now become fuel for this kind of lunatic scapegoating ritual. And, I interviewed Kent, somewhat sympathetically, not long after October 7th. And, we did an interview on what should the role of the America First segment of the right be vis-a-vis October 7th. And, Kent was still sort of playing the role of the mildly pro-Israel America First character at that point, we should have a transactional relationship, we should back our ally, etc. And so I point all this out to say that this is not a kind of unfortunate cultural eccentricity that's going to disappear because Donald Trump backs one faction and disavows another. It's a permanent feature of the electoral system, of the electoral calculus at this point. It lives in direct contact with and in a symbiotic relationship with the anti-masculine tendencies on the anti-Israel left. And so if you're an American, I think the appropriate attitude toward these things is they will destroy us if we don't destroy them. That's how I see it. Now, that would be the advice I would give to somebody who is running a political campaign or something like that. As a writer, I'm just trying to describe what happened and my own relationship to it.
Well, I think if there's an answer, there's never a permanent answer, right? If there's a constructive answer at a sort of systemic level, part of it comes from politics. I think a lot of it comes from culture in some sense. And this is a very kind of general statement, but it's sort of we need ways, we need platforms, we need writers, we need artists. I guess we need political figures, though I think often they're downstream of cultural productions that are just more integrated forms of processing all of these, not necessarily contradictory, but intention emotions and feelings. I don't even know if I have anything sort of concrete to say about that, other than, just to go back to your point about how the lionization of the special operations soldier is one version of a non-integrated way of processing this, like projecting yourself onto this hero. But what I wanted to ask you is, so you said one of your kids is a son, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought about this. I have two boys, 15 and 9, and thinking about what is a healthy masculinity that I can offer to them. And unfortunately, we're not, maybe fortunately, unfortunately, we're not able as fathers, we don't exert perfect control over the tradition we're handing down to our kids, right? We exist in a culture, whether it's American culture, Israeli culture, popular culture, where a lot of the influences they're getting about what it means to be a man are coming from outside of us, outside of the family, but we're important nonetheless. And I'm wondering for you, you say at some point in the piece, like, there are things in the traditional understanding of masculinity that you think are worth saving, that are virtuous or redemptive or something like that. I'm wondering for you personally, and then maybe we can think about how that would sort of ramify out culturally, but for you personally, when you're thinking about yourself as a father of a son, what is it of masculinity you would like to convey onto him or model? Probably model for him is probably the more, in terms of just psychological development of children, the way that you are existing as a man is probably more powerful than the verbal things you articulate to him. But, what is it you want him to understand by whatever means of transmission of what it would look like to be a good man?
Yeah, I want him to understand that that's rooted in responsibility, personal responsibility, but also a sense of where personal responsibility also requires an understanding of the foundations of personal responsibility, where those responsibilities derived from. So, specifically, I want my son to be able to fail as a process of learning, pick himself back up, to go through the sort of conventional aspects of American masculinity in particular that I think are really valuable. A tolerance for failure in pursuit of something new, adventure, great adventure, self-confidence, a willingness to try new things on, to plunge oneself into an unfamiliar vista and try to learn the lay of the land. Strength, like physical strength, but also emotional strength. These things are all important, I think. A willingness to learn from others. In other words, American in the sense that it reflects a democratic attitude, not a European aristocratic attitude or a sectarian attitude from other parts of the world, but a sense that I could learn from anybody, right? Which is, we think of perhaps as Americans, in the American context, we think of as a universal characteristic, but it's not really a universal characteristic at all. And so I believe in all those things. Now, I also want my son to be able to daven, meaning go through tefillah, the English equivalent would be prayer, in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. I want my son to know how to read from the Torah, to know the Torah, as an adult, he'll figure out what level of practical observance he is going to apply in his own life. But I grew up with a strong Jewish cultural identity. I didn't grow up reading the Parsha, the Torah portion every week. I didn't grow up knowing the structure of Jewish prayer services. And I want my son to have all of that and to have a rooting in the Jewish story that connects him to the full breadth of that story and not only the modern retelling of that story. And those things I want both of those, the sort of characteristic American independence, boldness of spirit, a certain kind of libertarian attitude, frontier libertarianism in particular. I'll go somewhere new with nothing but my wits and my gumption and I'll get it done. I think that's powerful stuff. I think that being able to rely on one's own body, to be able to rely on one's own strength in a dangerous situation is extraordinarily important for men in particular, in terms of their self-worth and in terms of their ability to carry out the vision of themselves that they wish to become. That it's important to be strong physically. It's important to be strong Doesn't mean you need to be a bodybuilder. It means you need to be able to rely on your own physical strength to do things in the world. At the same time, to balance that with élan, with a sensitivity to art, to devotion to learning. So there's a lot of things. They don't necessarily meld into one immediately recognizable universal archetype. But I'm trying to, as you said, modeling is so much more. I mean, you very quickly discover this when you have kids, that it's, and I have a tendency, unfortunately, as a writer, with, the intellectual predilection, I start speechifying to my children. Now, son, my father called me son. My father would say, and I call my son, son. It's a habit that I picked up. And I was a son. I want you to understand that he's 5 years old. He's going to do what he sees me do. At a later age, I think communicating becomes more important. But so at this age, I try to get that across to him.
Do you feel like you have a bead on what Israeli culture, because your kids are going to grow up Israeli? I mean, they'll have a hefty dose of Americanism, but assuming you guys stay, they're going to grow up Israeli. And I don't feel like I have a bead on, in terms of these questions of masculinity, of what Israeli culture bestows upon or imposes upon kids, boys, growing up. I guess my guess would be it is a more macho culture. It's a culture with a much more sort of pervasive tradition of military service at this point, right? Presumably your son will serve. I don't know what the rules are for girls. Maybe your daughter will serve as well. But at the same time, I also imagine it as a kind of fairly traumatized culture, as is America, but just in different ways, in ways that impact masculinity. But I don't feel like I have any tangible sense of how that plays out. I mean, you're not a native-born Israeli.
Yeah. I think that Ashkenazi Jews are a traumatized people, and that Ashkenazi Jews in particular carry trauma in their culture, but that trauma is much more pronounced and impactful and decisive in America than it is in Israel. So I think that Ashkenazi Jews in Israel carry some of the same trauma as Ashkenazim in the Galut, but to a much lesser extent. In part because they are stronger here, physically stronger. I mean, they have more faith in their ability to defend themselves. And so what is Israeli culture and what will this mean for my kids? I mean, I think one of the key differences in Israeli culture is that, like, in America, there's something manly about escaping the family, right? And Don Draper, in a way, even though he's born an orphan, so it's imposed on him, it's still valorizing. It's valorizing being an orphan in a way, right? Like, yeah, of course, the show has to present it as the great trauma and tragedy of his life, but it's at the heart of his mythos. It's what makes him not only cool and sexy and romantic and irresistible to women. The fact that he's an orphan is not only inextricable from all of that, it's also what makes him a business genius, a genius in the advertising business. All of this comes from the fact that he's unencumbered by family and tradition, and so therefore can be whoever he dreams himself to be. Okay, that characteristic, that quality of total self-invention, which is there in Walt Whitman and is there in Don Draper and Mad Men as well, simply doesn't exist in Israel. It's not here. There is no desire to escape the family, be a creature of pure mythological self-invention in the same way. It just doesn't exist here. And that's a profound difference that is probably at the root of many other lesser related differences.
It's interesting because your kids will grow up in that, and yet you are that. You have qualities of Draperdom, right? I mean, even the making Aliyah to Israel is a form of that, right? I mean, you haven't rejected your family, but you're fairly self-invented in some respects.
No, yes, God forbid. I would never want to reject my family, but no, you're exactly right. I'm an American. I'll die an American. I'll die in Israel, an American, but I was 40 years old when I moved here. I'm an American. I'll always be an American in my formative experiences and my cultural expectations, my premises about the world. And I want to impart some of that to my kids. I didn't move here because I hated everything about America and wanted to escape it. It wasn't what drove the move here. And there are aspects of Americanism that I want to impart to my kids. It's funny. I have a friend here who's also born in Brooklyn, who's also a U.S. Army veteran who served in Afghanistan and who's now a religious settler, as it would be termed in America. And, he's like simultaneously kind of exaggerated caricature of a certain kind of Israeli, and he's also like an exaggerated caricature of a certain kind of American simultaneously, and I'm fine with that. And
Warning!
Okay. Did you hear that?
Okay.
Okay, that means we just got a warning for an attack. So
it's abrupt, but it's a fine place to stop. I wasn't going to hold you for too much longer. Anyway, thanks for doing that. Get safe.
Thanks for having me, man. I look forward to being in touch more.
All right. See ya.
Bit.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to Josh Howard for editing this episode of the podcast. Thanks to Alec Owensworth, legendary frontman of Clap Your Hands Say Yeah, for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you've enjoyed the show, which I imagine you have if you made it this far, please rate us and comment on your podcast platform of choice. And if you want to connect with me personally for whatever reason, you can get me at djops@gmail.com, djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond in a relatively timely fashion as long as you are relatively civil in your communique. As the great Bill and Ted once said, be excellent to each other. Peace.